Josh, the governor just released this proposal on changing the pension plans. What are some of the main points, the major changes he wants to make?
Some of the big plans that he's got are to create, for new workers going forward, hybrid pensions, which are partly a small part like the defined benefit plan that they've got now under CalPERS, but we'll also have a bigger component of a 401k type plan, which is sort of what the American standard has become, but is not something that a lot of public workers are used to. He would be pushing the retirement ages later for new workers. He would be using a 3-year average of pay to determine the pension benefits instead of a single one. That's an effort to prevent some of the spiking and other abuses that have gone in the system. For all workers, there'd be an even split of contribution between employer and employee. 50-50 contribution split. And all of these things really have the public workers unions up in arms. They're not happy about this at all. And a lot of the legislative Democrats who often represent these unions' interests are also similarly tepid at best about the plan.
But Judge, didn't the unions know that this was in the works?
They did. And their point is they've made some concessions already, but they feel that the nature of the problem has been misconstrued by the public, that the average pension benefit for a public worker is not exorbitant, that there have been abuses, there are some extremes, but that your average CalPERS beneficiary is not making bank off of this. Opinions vary. What is known is that there's a huge unfunded liability. Some people say it's as much as $500 billion going forward that has to be addressed. The legislature is working on a plan that they're going to roll out in the first quarter of next year. The governor has put this plan out. I think we should look at this plan sort of the way that people have looked at President Obama's American Jobs Act. This is what I think we should do. Now let's see what we can actually negotiate, what we can do.
Well, wasn't that exactly one of the points of the union, saying that pension issues should be collectively bargained? It shouldn't be something that comes from the governor. It should be part of larger issues when you talk about pay and other benefits. Put that in the mix. But perhaps they didn't come to the table on their own first, which maybe the governor wanted. That he, as you said, he used this kind of as the opening salvo, at least to say, let's get there. This is what you face if you don't come and give us something.
Exactly. You know, he's sort of setting some parameters here. You saw it in the statements that Assembly Speaker John Perez and Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg put out following his announcement, basically saying, interesting ideas. We'll take it under consideration. Let's talk. You know,
but this goes to the voters, right? I mean, we'll go through the legislature.
It'll go. The governor wants the legislature to put it on the ballot. Okay. And he's not really shown a lot of willingness to go directly to a voter initiative the way that he probably will for the tax hikes next year. So he really does want to work with the legislature on this to some extent. And you'll probably see some of these elements of his plan advance, but some of them are probably, he probably knows that some of these are sort of non-starters, but he wants to set it out there, put everything on the table, and see what he can get through the legislature.
So what are lawmakers saying? I mean, who are his allies on this?
Well, surprisingly, and who would have foreseen this a year ago, there were some happy faces on the Republican side of the aisle. There were some Republican state senators who were saying, yeah, you know, maybe we'd like to even do a little bit more, but we can get behind this. We'll put this on the ballot. Democrats, not so much. You know, like I said, they often tend to have the union's interests at heart to some extent. For instance, Darrell Steinberg's rhetoric was a provocative set of reforms. We'll approach them with an open mind. But we can't forget that the vast majority of public sector employees are middle-class workers, and their average pensions are far from exorbitant. He doesn't want to see this basically laid on the backs of workers.
Because behind the unions are the workers.
Behind the unions are the workers, and in front of the unions are a lot of the Democrats' campaign bankrolls.
So politically, for Jerry Brown, I mean, it does show a politician at the tail end of his career potentially. I mean, he could run for governor again, or maybe he'll try a presidential run. But really, he's showing that he doesn't have to toe the party line, because he's been there, done that, and he said he's going to come in with independent ideas, and it certainly is showing
I think this would make it a lot harder for someone to argue that he's beholden to the public sector unions, as some have accused him in the past. On the other hand, I think he's also putting this out there knowing that not all of it's going to go through, but this is how he starts, you know, this is the hand that he starts out with.
What are the savings? That's the bottom line. What does this do for California's budget problems?
Well, it's not so much the budget problem. The structural budget deficit and the pensions unfunded liabilities are two very different things. So this is not really a budget issue per se. Eventually, it could become a budget issue further down the line if we get to the point of those liabilities needing to be paid off. At the moment, the governor estimates that his reform plan would save the state somewhere in the vicinity of $4 billion to $11 billion over 30 years. And maybe $21 billion to $56 billion over 60 years. So this is one of those things where you got to take the long view. The chair of the Republican Party came out this week and said, we can't wait 60 years. We got to fix this right now. But again, he's sort of engaging in a kind of partisan rhetoric that even some of the Republicans in the legislature are not really quick to say. They think this is at least a decent starting place. So.
Well, the city that the governor was mayor of for a long time made international news this week because of the Occupy movement. And Mina, you were there for some of the toughest parts of what happened in Oakland in terms of the protesters and clashes with law enforcement officials.
Yeah, there were a lot of tense moments on Tuesday night, and there were a couple of instances when I was running from tear gas myself. The first one was at 8th and Washington initially when protesters were marching towards police headquarters. And as they approached that intersection, police, there were sort of these flash bangs that I heard, and protesters started scurrying everywhere, though they regrouped and they continued to march up Frank Ogawa Plaza. And there was the scene of another really tense interaction with police where police called an unlawful assembly and said that they needed to disperse or chemical agents would be used. But interestingly, though, some protesters wanted to sort of clash at that first moment at Frank Ogawa Plaza. They did not, in fact, do that. They continued to meander through the city for some time. And then at the end of the night, it turned really ugly where there were just several rounds of tear gas, police projectiles that were affecting multiple numbers of people and have left many questions at this point about what exactly was used that night in terms of the non-lethal weaponry by police and what kind of policies they were really following when they were, in fact, clashing with protesters.
Mina, that's one of the interesting things because it wasn't just the Oakland Police Department that was involved, but it was more than a dozen law enforcement agencies from the Bay Area that was brought in, and people are wondering who Oakland was supposed to be in charge, but were they in charge? Whose policies were they following? Whose orders were they following? If there were some violations of police practice and protocol, who's going to hold them accountable? I mean, there are a lot of questions on using that tactic, it seems.
Yeah, at today's, Mayor Jean Quan held a press conference today, and she said that they were looking into, that she has ordered a more complete investigation of what happened, what police tactics were used, and what the other police agencies may have had in their arsenal, the ones who had offered mutual aid for that night. So hopefully there'll be some answers to those questions. But I did visit the encampment today after all of that, and it was just a marked difference from Tuesday night. I mean, it was very calm. There were people meditating, praying. There was also a lot of excitement. Michael Moore paid a visit today and kind of ignited the group. But it makes sense. I mean, if you're a protester, you're feeling pretty good right now. You've had some significant victories. You've been allowed to reoccupy Frank Ogawa Plaza. You got an apology from the mayor. You have national groups like Move On, showing support, putting out a video that was just really critical of Mayor Kwan's handling of all of this, and you're also allowed to camp. I mean, there was no police interference with camping, even though there are multiple
Is this
calls.
camping overnight, or is this at the 10 o'clock curfew that the mayor had asked for?
The 10 o'clock curfew came and went, and tents remained there. And in fact, today, Chief Howard Jordan said that the line that he's going to be taking over the weekend is that there's going to be a minimal police presence through the weekend, and that they will only respond if there are service calls to the area.
And this melee the other night has sort of given the national movement its first martyr, too, huh?
Yes, Scott Olson, the 24-year-old Iraq War veteran. Well, he is recovering. He is expected to make a full recovery, but the injury was a fracture to his skull from a police projectile, and it has actually robbed him of his ability to talk, though they think that's temporary. But he has become sort of the battle cry. When I was at the encampment today, there was a photo of him, a large photo of him taped to one of the tents. So definitely he's becoming a symbol of the movement.
And And how's Jean Quan handling this? I mean, when I saw her in the press conference the other day, she looked like a deer in the headlights. She looked just terrible about it. She ordered the police in, apparently, or she allowed the police to go in, and yet she took off to go to Washington, D.C. at the time of really one of the biggest tests of her administration.
Yeah, Rachel, she's had a really tough week. I mean, you're right. She looked exhausted. She looked uncomfortable. She dodged questions about responsibility at Wednesday's press conference. I have to say, today's press conference, she tried to show that she had a little bit more control. She said things like, I'm the mayor, I'm responsible. And she also tried to put out sort of a plan in the sense that she said that public safety will be her #1 priority, that she would continue to order a minimal police presence. She said that as long as first responders, public health inspectors are allowed into the camp, she'll continue to work with the protesters, and also said that she will try to address them since she was booed.
Can you comment just a little bit on what's happened in San Francisco, San Jose, other surrounding cities while all this has been going on?
Sure. Well, San Francisco has had some interesting, I think Ed Lee is trying to take a different approach. He has been in negotiations directly with Occupy San Francisco folks, and his plan, as I understand it, is to continue these direct negotiations, to put out some conditions in hopes that San Francisco, the Occupy San Francisco movement protesters will sort of play ball with him, and he's trying to avoid what has become such an ugly scene in the national spotlight because there's a lot of political implications for him at stake if he mishandles this. So he's trying to take a slightly different approach by negotiating directly with protesters in a way that has a little bit more substance to it, I think.